dissident peasant, ladies and gentlemen.
I'm not trying to be reactionary here. I'm not trying to be overblown or melodramatic. He calls himself a socialist.
Now listen, I don't even think he believes in socialism, to be honest. I think he's, because which is it? Are have you?
Great fucking point.
Jeff from Georgia. What? Jeff from Georgia. What? Jeff from What?
Jeff from Georgia.
Hell yeah.
I'm crazy.
Socialism isn't cool.
This is Jeff from Georgia.
Hi, I'm the demon.
Dissident Peasant. Check out his podcast. Dissident Peasant.
Fantastic guy.
Dissident Peasant.
He's a world-class socialist.
DissidentPeasant.com. I don't want to be part of this.
Check out his podcast.
Patreon.com/DissidentPeasant.
What the hell do you have to lose? Everyone follow me on Twitter. Goodbye.
Yes, it is Wednesday, May the 1st, 2019. Happy May Day. This is the Dissident Peasant Podcast. I am, of course, your host, Jeff from Georgia. You know, I got tired of the instrumental theme song every week a little bit, so I thought I'd give you guys a little taste of the real stuff from my boy DJ Anarchy. Man, I love that theme song. On today's show, of course, I want to take some swings at Glass Jaw Joe. Yes, that is Joe Biden. And not literal swings, of course. These are all just metaphors for politics. Not advocating any actual violence. But of course, before I get to all that today, just a brief reminder that this show, like all these shows, is brought to you by listeners like you who go to patreon.com/dissidentpeasant. These episodes do take quite a bit of time to write, research, think of ideas, and then edit, engineer, and post, all for your enjoyment. And if you are listening, then I am already extremely grateful to you for simply your time and attention, which is the real reason I do this. So thank you for that. If you want to throw a little bit on top, though, like I said, you can go to patreon.com/dissidentpeasant or paypal.me/dissidentpeasant. You can check me out on Twitter at JeffHisDudeness. With all that out of the way, on with the show. So one of the cruelest lessons about the world a teenager or a young adult should learn before they get too old is that it's always better to be lucky than good. You see, the clever, the brave, the wise, the beautiful, the skilled, the learned, the strong, however much of whatever virtue a person holds, two things will always be true. The first is that there are over 7 billion people on this planet. Plenty of them are also clever, brave, wise, what have you. And the second sort of follows from the first, because what billions of people do not have in equal measure is luck. That ineffable and simple word we use to define being in the right place at the right time, or prevailing via improbability, or possessing the right circumstances of birth, and a million other little things. It is luck, not virtue, that most often determines a person's journey through life. And part of becoming a clear-eyed, but socially well-adjusted human being is the struggle to find other reasons to be all and more of the things I mentioned before in terms of virtue. Because of its success or social esteem that you're after, virtue has never been enough. One brief disclaimer born of charity, if not of fairness, to my subject. This luck, such as it is, has not extended to Joe Biden's personal and family life. This is true. He has suffered great personal tragedy and loss in his life, and I won't be discussing any of that today, nor would I entertain any attacks that utilize that pain for gain. But if it does seem cruel to you, dear listener, to call a man with a background such as his lucky, I can only reply that luck's a pretty mysterious, yet singular thing. It's possible and, in fact, universal that sometimes we're lucky and sometimes we're not, depending on both time and context. And as far as his political career goes, Joe Biden got where he is not through an abundance of smarts or cunning or leadership. He got there through luck. Exhibit A for my contention that it's better to be lucky than good is Joe Biden's first federal election. In 1972, the tiny state of Delaware's Republican senator, a guy named J. Caleb Boggs, wanted to retire. He was nearing the end of his second 6-year term as a senator, and having previously served as U.S. representative and governor of the state, at 63 years old, he wanted out. This would have meant a decisive primary fight on the Republican side to fill the resulting power vacuum, so President Nixon himself persuaded Boggs to stick it out one more cycle. On the Democratic side, assuming that the Big Dick Boggs would cruise to an easy third term now, enthusiasm for being the sacrificial candidate was low, leaving a young, liberal New Castle County councilman named Joseph Robinette Biden as his only opposition. And you know what? He got lucky. In 1972, only about 572,000 people lived in Delaware, and that figure includes children, prisoners, and other populations who couldn't or didn't vote. So not having much money to reach voters matters much less when the state is so small, both in terms of population and geography. It's also pretty lucky that Boggs didn't really seem to want the job because he didn't want his job. And it's lucky that Nixon's surgical dismantling that year of George McGovern gave him very short congressional coattails. Biden won election by a little more than 3,000 votes on a mostly liberal Orthodox platform. I now want to go through 5 times where, frankly, Joe Biden was near the front of the herd in making our modern society and its resulting collapse in institutions, the rule of law, and supercharged global capitalism that's making it so hard for people to just live these days, let alone improve their lives. This is not meant to be a definitive and comprehensive takedown, just a starting point, a primer, a partially complete summation of some things that have been on my mind about Joe. But really, it's all about how being an ineffectual opponent to creeping American authoritarianism and hyper-exploitative economics at best, and being that system's handmaiden at worst, can propel you through a long and soaring career. A career fueled by luck in the first place, and lacking exactly the right kind of virtues in exactly the right kind of way in the second. Let's start with busing. You were probably taught in school that the famous Supreme Court decision Brown v. Board of Education outlawed school segregation in 1954. And this is more true than not, I'd say. But of course, it was always more complicated than that, and that was hardly the end of segregated schools in America. For one thing, resistance to court-ordered efforts to integrate schools and the generally slow pace of justice meant that well into the 70s, cases were still being litigated about segregation in schools, and cautious politicians and bureaucrats who answered to them were very slow to integrate school systems themselves. Something else to keep in mind is housing. Residential neighborhoods in the United States then tended to be very segregated, not because of any law of nature, but through the efforts of a white ruling class, both formally and informally, to segregate themselves. Now, schools, as local institutions then and now, generally serve their surrounding communities. So, imagine a scenario in which a school is surrounded by all-white or nearly all-white neighborhoods, and in which de jure segregation is done away with, segregation written into law. That school would remain segregated, and such a remedy as doing away with legal segregation would be rather pointless. I think the solution is pretty obvious. We have motorized transportation now, so we can bus children from one neighborhood to another, mix them all together, and therefore integrate public schools. Now, this was oversimplified a tad, maybe basically the plan in the late 60s and early 70s in some districts as judges began ordering busing plans. Now, I've read in some places that history has not been kind to defenders of this policy, which was sometimes inconvenient for those involved or poorly implemented or just bizarrely implemented at times. And for my part, it does seem a bit of a bank shot that avoids the real problem of segregated housing and property tax-based funding of public education. On the other hand, this was 20 years after Brown v. Board, and many, many classes of children in different areas of this country had entered school, grown up, and graduated, all in segregated public schools. Foolish and timid people, who nonetheless want to appear wise and judicious, often have 1,000 reasons for why doing what seems obvious and right can't actually be done. And that's as true for Joe Biden today as it was during his first Senate term in the 70s on this issue. Though he ran on a liberal platform that included being an integrationist, as was his opponent for the record, his rhetoric during the campaign, and especially after his election, began to twist itself into knots when he was asked about busing, to where it seemed a little unclear of just how integrationist he really was, opposing busing in some cases, but not in others. Now, despite his softening stance, he continued to receive jeers and boos for not outright condemning busing, infuriating white Delawareans who had voted for him and who were protected through de facto segregation policies. Whether from calculation or conviction, in response, Biden supported a 1975 amendment by notorious racist Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina. Quoting Jesse Helms, quote, "This is an anti-busing amendment. This is an amendment to stop the current regiments of faceless federal bureaucrats from destroying our schools," end quote. Quote, "I have become convinced that busing is a bankrupt concept," end quote. Biden replied in support of Helms, among other things. Now, Helms's amendment would have set back federal integration enforcement by decades. And it's a really good thing that Biden and Helms lost this fight. But in fact, once Helms wasn't the messenger anymore, they did win, basically. As a photogenic young liberal spokesman for anti-busing politics, who strangely insisted that forced busing, as he called it, did nothing to honor African-American culture or actually improve their education, Biden helped make anti-busing politics respectable, the province of not just slack-jawed racists, say in Middle Georgia, but smiling attorneys from Delaware. After an originally sweeping amendment that would have prohibited federal funds from being used by school systems, quote, "to assign teachers or students to schools for reasons of race," end quote, which would not just have set back school integration, but have severe implications for Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which I will not be getting into, Biden's concessionary amendment banned only the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare from ordering any busing. This amendment did indeed become law, its passage led by a man who once declared that he got into politics because of civil rights, and who then went on to deliver the eulogy at Strom Thurmond's funeral. Let's talk about crime. In 1989, after an embarrassingly poor showing trying to run for president the year before, Joe Biden was the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and old Poppy Bush was president. Poppy Bush had a brilliant idea to stop illegal drug use. Put a bunch of people in prison. Now, sure, he dressed it up with fancier language than that, and the details were in how precisely he achieved my glibly delivered summation, of course, but how else can I describe, quote, "more prisons, more jails, more courts, more prosecutors," end quote. In his televised response to Poppy Bush, Joe Biden lambasted the Republican president as a wuss, a coward, and a dummy, more or less. The only idea smarter than put more people in cages to stop illegal drug use is put even more people than that into cages to stop illegal drug use. And that's what Joe went with. Quote, "Quite frankly, the president's plan is not tough enough, bold enough, or imaginative enough to meet the crisis at hand." He went on, "In a nutshell, the president's plan does not include enough police officers to catch the violent thugs, enough prosecutors to convict them, enough judges to sentence them, or enough prison cells to put them away for a long time," end quote. Ever hear of that infamous disparity between rock and powdered cocaine sentencing? Biden bragged that anyone with a rock the size of a quarter went to jail for 5 years minimum on his watch. You've ever heard of the process of civil asset forfeiture, where law enforcement can seize the property of merely accused criminals? Joe Biden bragged about this, too. His 1994 crime bill, which he once proudly affixed his name to as the Biden crime bill, took grant money away from prisoners looking to pursue higher education, created dozens of new offenses eligible for the federal death penalty, mandated drug testing for prisoners under supervised release, and introduced the 3 strikes rule to the federal level. That's the 3 crimes and you'll never be free again doctrine. Dramatic increases in the rate of incarceration in the United States did precede the Biden crime bill by a few years, but it was a huge log to throw in the fire, particularly in terms of the massive financial support it offered for cops, FBI agents, and DEA agents, especially considering that it's the states themselves that do most of the prisoning in our country, not the feds. Before a beaming Biden stood next to President Clinton during the signing ceremony for a bill to create a brutal prison-based society, he delivered these chilling words on the Senate floor. Quote, "The liberal wing of the Democratic Party is now for 60 new death penalties. The liberal wing of the Democratic Party has 70 enhanced penalties. The liberal wing of the Democratic Party is for 100,000 cops. The liberal wing of the Democratic Party is for 125,000 new state prison cells." End quote. Biden has expressed regret in recent years, and only the recent ones, to be sure, for the bill that he literally wrote, just as he expressed regret in the early 80s at Reagan's tough-on-crime policies. For Joe, politics is just about lucking into a Senate seat in one of the smallest states in the Union, not about virtues like consistency. Let's talk finance. Now, once upon a time in 1978, the United States Supreme Court decided credit card companies could export interest rates to cardholders residing in other states. Despite South Dakota doing its damnedest to lead the resulting race to the bottom among states for credit card companies to locate there, Joe Biden's home state of Delaware was the eventual victor. Basically because most of these companies were already in New York and didn't want to move operations to South Dakota, as nice as South Dakota is. As a result, state laws regulating usury had effectively been abolished, and Delaware's model of basically no ceiling on interest rates, generous options on the fees banks can charge, and a literally inverted tax scheme where the more profit a bank makes, the lower its tax rate, is basically the model for the nation. Now, Joe Biden didn't really make this happen as a senator, of course. I just want to tell you how the partners he's about to go dancing with came to the ball, since you already know how Joe Biden stumbled in there dick first. In 2005, under the Orwellian title Bankruptcy, Abuse Prevention, and Consumer Protection Act, we got some new rules about finance in the United States. This time, if not authored by Joe Biden, then consistently supported and justified by him over time. Just a quick caveat, as usual, I'm not a lawyer, and this is not a comprehensive explainer on the Bankruptcy, Abuse Prevention, and Consumer Protection Act of 2005. But, that said, under the pretense of fraud and abuse of bankruptcy courts, the law made it incredibly easy to allege abuse in a bankruptcy filing and get their case dismissed. Challenges to these findings of abuse became so easy to find and so hard to fight that they required very costly litigation, exactly the sort of litigation someone filing for bankruptcy can't really afford to get into. The act also made all student loan debt non-dischargeable in bankruptcy, made the discharge of liability for medical debt hard, and basically just made it harder in many, many, many ways, big and small, to get relief from any bankruptcy court for a regular person. Now, anytime a big piece of legislation is debated in Congress, good or bad, there's something called an amendment process to make it either less good or less bad. I know, politics is complicated. Anyway, this bill was bad, but let's say Biden was just an early co-sponsor, so maybe he figured it was going to pass anyway, and he was trying to get marginal improvements to it via amendment in. Nah. Amendments that defined exceptions for people in the military or for large medical debts. Biden said no. Limited accountability for debts encouraged by predatory lending practices, i.e., if they trick you. Biden said no. An end to companies shopping across venues for creditor-friendly judges? Nah, Biden said no. Even something as tepid as requiring the companies gouging everyone to adequately warn consumers in writing about the consequences of only paying the minimum on their credit card every month. Joe said no. This bankruptcy bill was so bad and so contrary to his entirely fabricated image as middle-class Joe, a moniker he affixed to himself, that it alone is reason enough to make Elizabeth Warren bluntly dismissive of him as an ally to anyone but bankers. And she's no seize the means plus guillotines type. Let's talk about justice. Specifically, Joe Biden's sense of justice as chair of the United States Senate Committee on the Judiciary from 1987 to 1995. Now, one thing that body does is hold the hearings for nominated Supreme Court justices. Justices like alleged sexual harasser Clarence Thomas. On his watch, Anita Hill, 35, a brave black woman, stood before 14 aged white men who possessed varying levels of hostility to her and what she was about to say, and whose ranks included world-class asshole Strom Thurmond. Over the course of several excruciating minutes, she calmly described Thomas's insistence that they date, his habit of talking about sex in vivid detail, describing pornography to her, bragging to her about how good he was at fucking, and the time that he accused Anita Hill of putting a pubic hair on his can of cola, among other things. She was met with a response from the Senate and old Joe that unfortunately is all too familiar to women probably, then and now. They accused her of exaggeration, fabrication, they minimized the incidents that she described, and they were just generally assholes to her, mostly, though not everyone. As you can imagine, the worst behavior came from the Republican side, of course, but Joe Biden's questions themselves were as probing as anyone else's, if often convoluted and awkwardly phrased. He wasn't even neutral during the hearings, arguably, let alone supportive of Anita Hill in any way. He claimed then and now that he didn't have the power to gavel down the behavior of his incredibly disgusting colleagues, but honestly, gavel or no, he didn't do shit for her, either in word or deed. They were also his hearings to set up, and despite the fact that 3 other women were ready to testify about their own experiences and observations, as well as detail separate accusations in at least one case, he wouldn't allow anyone else to take the stand. Just Miss Hill and 14 white men of varying degrees of hostility to her were present. And despite whatever airbrushed and fedora-capped writer at the Federalist tells you that actually it's Clarence Thomas that deserves an apology, it just ain't so. Anita Hill deserved, and deserves, frankly, an apology. And the mealy-mouthed words Biden wrote a few days ago, regret for what happened to her and admiration for her fortitude, does not an apology constitute. And that's not my call. That was Miss Hill's. What's more, Clarence Thomas is a truly reprehensible and dull man, renowned for his incurious nature and heaps of financial conflict involving Republican politics and his wife, who makes quite a good living mucking about in such mud pits. Rarely do personal and political failures culminate so neatly into a single act of malpractice that reverberates negatively for generations of people. So well done, you lucky Irish idiot. Finally, let's talk about vice presidency. Despite being an incredibly unreliable vote for the left and an incredibly potent symbol of how things have always been, Barack Hope and Change Obama picked the simultaneously boring and gaffe-prone senator to be his vice president, after privately assuring him that he would be given a portfolio of significance in the White House. Now, the vice presidency is almost infamously not worth a bucket of warm piss. So without the president's backing for your power, you don't really get to do much. And luckily for Joe, and unluckily for the nation, one of Biden's responsibilities that he had significant influence over was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, more commonly known as the stimulus package, designed to stabilize the American economy during a period of mass layoffs and bank failures. It is not possible for me to tell you exactly how much blame to lay for all this at his feet, but Joe Biden himself still touts his leadership and management of this program as a positive, a program that was far too small for the crisis at hand and contained far too many tax breaks that weren't actually stimulative, and a program that consigned my generation to at least one lost decade and counting. In other words, great job, Joe. He was there for passage of the Affordable Care Act, which he called a big fucking deal. You may remember that. Would that he had been correct about that, in my opinion. Now, as to the merits of the incremental reforms passed in the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, I'm mostly ambivalent, perhaps slightly positive. Marginal improvements to a population of hundreds of millions of people does mean millions of lives improved for the better, after all. But what I am more sure of, frankly, is that no, the ACA was not a big fucking deal, at least not for very long. The entire regime they all had planned and advocated for, with efficient markets of consumer choice in health insurance, with subsidies and, yes, some reforms of abuses by big business in the healthcare sector, as well as protections for pre-existing conditions, this act has been almost entirely destroyed. And while it would be unfair to lay all of that at Joe Biden's feet, it's also fair to say that he ain't learned shit since then. With the first step to a solution, universal Medicare, staring every Democratic politician in the face, even conservative Democrats like Kamala Harris feel the need to sort of support it and sort of not. Joe Biden refuses to even pretend. As of this writing, Joe Biden supports a Medicare buy-in so that those with a certain amount of wealth can buy their way out of an exploitative for-profit health insurance industry, and the rest of us can be safely exploited by those same companies. After his initial announcement that he was officially running for president, Joe Biden numbers have supposedly surged to 36 points, with the second-place candidate, my boy Bernie Sanders, 14 points behind him. There is some reason to be skeptical of the latest polls in question and their accuracy, and there are additional reasons to suspect that Joe Biden's support is actually very soft. But though this opinion is a little complicated, I think Joe's both weaker than people think he is and strong enough to have a big bullseye on his back. And you know what? I think he'll lead with his chin, like he always does. He's got that big dumb mouth full of fake teeth, and he's convinced that he himself is our modern Cicero, our Pericles, our Daniel Webster, full of virtue and vision and eloquence. The man who can see his opponent and reach him through personal charm and will. After all, isn't that what politics is all about? That is not what politics is all about. Politics isn't about reputation or relationships, at least not in the first order. No, politics is about resources and the distribution thereof, if you ask me. Joe Biden thinks of conservatives and reactionaries as adversaries, certainly, but in doing so, he gives away of how he sees the game. You see, it's him and people like him on one side. And whatever you want to call them, I think neoliberal seems fair. You choose your own poison. On the other side, there are these reactionaries. I don't exist in this game, and neither do you, in all probability, unless you are somehow a credit card company and listening to this. Our wants and needs are not to be considered, because the game isn't about us in Joe's mind, except maybe in a secondary sense or just the marketing language. No, what it's really about for him is feeling proud that you were able to get a yes out of Jesse Helms or Mitch McConnell, about getting that lucky handshake when no one else can. So keep sticking your chin out there, Joe. Keep telling everyone just how proud you are to work with our era's worst shitheads. The sorts of people who will be viewed with as much disgust and disdain as John Calhoun or Jefferson Davis are, hopefully. Keep telling us how you're the guy who can make deals with the people and institutions actively ruining our lives, and bankers and health insurance executives. Keep talking about getting things done. Lead with your chin, Joe, because I think it's made of glass. And I want to see you take some hits. Metaphorically, of course. Thank you for listening. I know I left a lot of stuff out. Didn't even talk about his groping or Israel or 1,000 other things I could have. So, if you want to let me know why else Joe Biden sucks ass, then hit me up on Twitter at JeffHisStudentist. Remember, patreon.com/dispeasant. I will see you